Salzburg, where the composer Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was born in 1756, is a pretty town situated on the banks of the river Salz and overlooked by a splendid castle. Many visitors come to enjoy the sights and hear the music of Salzburg's most famous sound. Mozart was christened in the cathedral. It was built in the 17th century by the reigning Archbishop of Salzburg, one of the elected princes of the Holy Roman Empire. The Archbishop was the ruler of Salzburg and the salt mines in the nearby mountains, from which he had a huge income. The archbishops lived in this palace and were rich enough to keep up a flamboyant style of living, with a court orchestra and numerous palaces. The Mirabell Palace was built for a mistress of one of the archbishops. Elements of the magnificent original interior survive, and they give an idea of an extravagant lifestyle. The large number of church towers in the city indicate just how influential the church was. The Archbishop had great power over his subjects and his employees. One of these employees, beginning in 1743, was Leopold Mozart, father of the composer. Leopold came from the town of Augsburg in southern Germany, where his family were bookbinders. His talents and their development were quite remarkable for the son of a craftsman. At 18 he went to study philosophy and law in Salzburg, a no less unusual step to take. Leopold enjoyed the artistic life of Salzburg. It was a town small enough to be in touch with the rustic charms of the country, yet in its court life and its beautiful buildings, at the same time sophisticated and cultured. Within a year, Leopold was made a Bachelor of Philosophy and commended for his work. But music was demanding more and more of his time, and a year later he was expelled for being too often absent. A local nobleman, Count Thurn, took him on in the dual role of valet and musician. In an indirect way, he had begun his musical career. In 1743, Leopold became the fourth violinist in the Archbishop's orchestra. In 1747, Leopold Mozart married Anna Maria Pertl, the daughter of a lawyer. They were considered to be a handsome couple, and they moved into an apartment on the third floor of this house at number 9 Getreidegasse. Here, Leopold taught music all day long. He bought and sold musical instruments, and he wrote music. He wrote a guide to violin playing, which was long recognized throughout Europe as the standard work on the subject. His undoubted talent as a composer was inevitably to be overshadowed by the work of his son. But above all, Leopold's destiny was to be the teacher of his two gifted children, to whose musical nourishment he devoted his life. It must be said that to be born into Leopold Mozart's house was to be born into an exceptional musical experience. His daughter Nannerl was born in 1751, 5 years before her brother. She developed into a remarkably fine pianist, but with the coming of little Wolfgang, life in the apartment in Getreidegasse changed dramatically. Wolfgang was at the keyboard in his third year, and at once began to show what was almost a disturbing precocity of musical talent. He learned new pieces quite naturally and produced his first compositions when he was 5 years old. Of course, Leopold recognized his son's genius and was not slow to display it to a wider world. By 1762, when Mozart was 5, he was playing before the Empress Maria Theresa in Vienna. Whatever or whoever the Empress took an interest in stood a good chance of being valued by the fashionable and noble world, the world that would ultimately advance Mozart's career. So Leopold was determined that everyone who mattered in the world should know about his son. They made money, of course, by giving concerts. The Empress sent the child, Mozart, and his sister Nannerl a gift of fine clothes, and paintings were duly made of them dressed up. In 1763, when Mozart was 7, they set off to tour Europe. Firstly, through several German towns to Paris, where they stayed for 5 months. On April 10, 1764, they left for London. They lived in this house in Chelsea. The King and Queen received them within days of their arrival. They found the English court very informal compared with Versailles. An important influence on the little boy was certainly the music of Handel, which he heard many times. He attended performances of Handel's operas, such as Acis and Galatea and Alexander's Feast. The king asked him to sight-read some Handel at a palace concert. On another visit he accompanied the Queen singing, and he played the organ, the harpsichord, and the violin. The children played at a charity concert at the Rotunda in Ranelagh Gardens, a popular place of amusement in Chelsea. Such precocity in so young a child obviously makes him in some eyes one of the 7 wonders of the world, and a learned member of the Royal Society called Daines Barrington wrote a paper on Mozart after examining him at length and hearing him play. They left London in July 1765 for home via Holland, but they did not reach Salzburg again until November 1766. Mozart was 11, and after the splendours of royal courts, Salzburg and its archbishop seemed parochial. During the next 9 months in Salzburg, Leopold took good care to keep up Mozart's education in music. There are records of the exercises in counterpoint he completed. At such an age he might have benefited from staying at home, but in September 1761 they set off for Vienna. However, a boy of 12 and a girl of 17 were no longer the wonder children of their last visit. Notwithstanding, in Vienna at that time, Mozart composed his first opera, La Finta Semplice, the Pretended Simpleton. However, it had to wait for a performance, and Leopold in his letters complained of jealous and unhelpful musicians. Towards the end of 1769, the Mozarts, father and son, set off on a tour of Italy. We know a lot about this tour because of their letters to Nannerl. They had great success in Bologna, which they enjoyed because they were guests of the warmly welcoming Count Pallavicini. He assembled a good orchestra for Mozart to conduct. Being accepted by the aristocracy as equals in intelligence and culture, was what Leopold valued most. In Florence, Mozart made a friend of his own age, the English boy Tom Linley. Linley was studying the violin, and his friendship was much valued by Mozart, who was to mourn Linley's early death by drowning some 10 years later. In Rome with the Pope, their success was tremendous. Mozart was given the Order of the Golden Spur, first class, which allowed him to use the title Chevalier. Ironically, his sponsor was a certain Count Colloredo, who was to be the next Archbishop of Salzburg. Back in Salzburg, the Mozarts as court musicians were regarded as little better than servants and looked down upon by members of the court. Mozart had begun to write his second opera, Mithridate Re di Ponto, Mithridates, King of Ponte. This time the work was performed at once in Milan on Boxing Day 1770 with enormous success. 20 performances were given, with Mozart conducting the first 3. In the next year or two they still travelled. In 1769, before the Italian tour, he had been appointed third concertmaster at the Salzburg Court Chapel. After a second Italian trip in 1770, in December the Palatine Court in Rome elected Count Colloredo to be the new Archbishop of Salzburg, and so Mozart's new employer. Colloredo was intelligent, gifted musically, just and diligent. He was also proud and even haughty. To Mozart, who had rubbed shoulders with kings and princes, real ones from an early age, Colloredo's autocratic behavior towards his talented composer was intolerable. But Mozart remained a further 2 years in provincial Little Salzburg. Undoubtedly, Colloredo was musical enough to value Mozart. In any case, Mozart more than did his job, pouring out new music way beyond the call of duty. Breaking away from Salzburg began in 1775, when the Elector of Bavaria asked Mozart to write a comic opera, La Finta Giardiniera. The Archbishop could hardly refuse permission, and the opera was an enormous success. The Archbishop improved his theatre for the use of visiting musicians, but not for the court players. Mozart couldn't bear it. The father and son asked for leave to make a concert tour. Colloredo said no. Mozart then asked for a discharge from service. He began a tour accompanied by his mother. They ended up in Mannheim, the hometown of the Weber family. The chief attraction to Mozart was Aloysia Weber, then 16, pretty, and possessed of a fine soprano voice. He wanted to travel to Italy with the Webers so that Aloysia could have good singing teachers. Leopold prevailed, and he went instead to Paris with his mother. Mozart and his mother could afford only poor lodgings. He earned what he could by teaching. They had no piano, and he had to go to a friend's house to practice. The mother was ill. They moved to better rooms, and though this suited the mother, her health deteriorated and she died on July 3rd. Mozart was offered the post of organist at Versailles at a reasonable salary. He turned it down. He composed the Paris Symphony and he gave a number of concerts, but he still complained to his father that the visit was fruitless. He set off for Salzburg, where his father assured him he could have the job of concertmeister at court, with himself in the job of Kapellmeister, also vacant at the time. Leopold didn't get his job, and Mozart dawdled in Mannheim and Munich. In Munich was Aloysia Weber, and he hoped to announce their engagement. Aloysia was, however, now earning a lot at the opera, and could see no future with Mozart. She turned him down, and he was broken-hearted. There was nothing for it but to return to Salzburg, where the post of court organist was offered to him. During the next 2 years he was to write his first mature compositions. In 1779 there were 2 symphonies, a symphonic concertante for violin and viola, and his coronation mass. He also got a commission for another opera in Munich. This was to be Idomeneo for the Munich Carnival of 1780. It was a great success. About the same time, Aloysia Weber married an actor, Joseph Langer, who painted this unfinished portrait of Mozart, considered to be the best likeness of the composer. In spite of the success of his opera, or maybe because of it, he was growing more weary of his role as a servant of the Archbishop. In 1781 he had to go to Vienna on duty for the coronation of the new Emperor Joseph II. In Vienna he was well known to many important people, yet he ate with the bishop's servants, and while in company was supposed to sit with the musicians. It became more than his pride could take. In a fiery interview with the Archbishop, he was rebuked for his insolence, and he in turn resigned his post. It was a bold step to take, especially as he knew it could even affect his father's position in Salzburg. The Weber family was now living in Vienna, and as the father had died, Frau Weber was only too happy to take Mozart in as a lodger. After all, she had 2 more daughters as yet unmarried. Mozart now had nothing to live on but what he could earn as an independent composer and musician. To think of marriage at such a time was foolhardy, but there was Costanza, the second Weber daughter, and it was soon clear that she was to be his wife. Mozart, although he had a jolly and irrepressible side to his nature, was also a sincere, and in his own eyes, a respectable man. When it was clear that his feelings for Costanza were returned, then he committed himself to her completely. Publishers were happy to buy his works for publication. He gave lessons for high fees, and by the summer of the year he was busy on his second major opera, Die Entführung aus dem Serail, or The Escape from the Seraglio. On the helpful recommendation of the court composer Gluck, whom he had met in Paris, Die Entführung was produced in 1782, and it was an enormous success. Costanza and Mozart were married in St. Stephen's Cathedral on August 4, 1782, not long after the triumph of Die Entführung. Costanza was 19, he was 26. Mozart's father did not bless the marriage till after it was over, but in fact they were extremely happy together. The money Mozart earned from concerts and composition was erratic, and their control of it was equally so. It didn't make for a stable life. The most important factor was that during all their ups and downs, Mozart could go on composing. While his wife was in labor, he finished the 6 great quartets for Haydn. Haydn became one of his staunchest supporters. But Haydn came from a poor and relatively uneducated background. He was in princely employment until he was 60, when he retired on a pension and started to travel. Mozart had tremendous popular success. People whistled the tunes from his operas in the streets, but he got no royalties from them, only a fee from the first production. It was hard. On May 1st, 1786, the first performance of The Marriage of Figaro was given in Vienna. It was a great success, not just because of the beautiful music, but because of the fine and topical libretto. Mozart wore fine clothes, went everywhere, was a Freemason — this was like being in the best club in town — and gave the impression of being as successful financially as he was by reputation. A hit in Vienna meant that other opera houses around Europe wanted his operas also. A nearby capital where he was greatly appreciated was Prague. In January 1787, Mozart went there with his wife, and they were given a lavish welcome. He gave concerts and was in the theatre when Figaro was performed. He was given a commission for another opera, and after a few weeks they left to seek out the librettist da Ponte, who had done so well for them with Figaro. Lorenzo da Ponte was an Italian, and although the idea of doing the Don Juan story was Mozart's, da Ponte needed a text to work from, and the one he got was from Venice, a play written in 1736 about Don Giovanni by the great playwright Carlo Goldoni. With Don Giovanni to write, Mozart was busy enough, but he produced other fine works along the way, and it is not surprising to find him ill. The young Beethoven had just visited him at 8 Schullerstrasse, where they lived. They left the city centre and moved to the country suburbs nearby. He there received news of his father's death. Leopold had been ill for some time, but they had remained good friends to the end, and Leopold had lived long enough to know that his efforts on his son's behalf were not in vain. Back in Prague in November, the finishing touches were put to Don Giovanni, with not much time to spare, and the staging was difficult. Mozart awaited the outcome of this new production nervously. It was a brilliant success, and it came at an opportune moment. Back in Vienna, Gluck died on November 15th, a few days after they returned. The Emperor appointed Mozart court composer on a salary of 800 gulden. As he got only 100 gulden for all his work on Figaro, for example, it was not a mean income. Don Giovanni was given a tepid welcome when it was performed in Vienna in April 1788. Later in the year, Mozart wrote his 3 great final symphonies. As no preparatory work exists, we have to suppose that he composed them in his head and simply wrote them out, while Costanza gossiped, no doubt. They took 6 weeks to complete. We also know that he was pawning things and borrowing from a rich Freemason friend called Puchberg. On top of this, he was ill, an illness that created lassitude and took away his normal high spirits and optimism. Costanza herself was ill. She had had several children, but given the terrible child care of the age, only 2 of them survived. But childbearing brought its problems, and she was sent for months to Baden to be cured. The expense of this only added to Mozart's worry. Mozart was very fortunate in the happiness he derived from his marriage. He needed it because for the rest of his short life he was weighed down by the constant need to earn money, to compose, to maintain his position in society as he saw it, and by the increasing burden of illness. His letters to Puchberg show pathetically the depth of his despair. But in July 1789, the emperor commissioned a new opera from Mozart and Da Ponte, and Così fan tutti was on its way. It was not produced until January 1790, and by then he was short of money again. Così was enthusiastically received, but the work had broken Mozart's health, and 1790 was not a good year for composition. He had to take more pupils and hoped they would come to his apartment near St. so that he would not exhaust himself trailing after them all over Vienna. Drawings and descriptions of him at this time suggest he was suffering from kidney disease. In September he pawned his silver and went to Frankfurt, where he hoped to give concerts at the coronation of Leopold II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He was back home at the end of November, not much richer. Mozart had one more year of life, and for some reason, though his illness went on apace, his spirits revived and his music poured forth. Emanuel Schikaneder owned a theatre at the Kärtner Tor and commissioned the opera The Magic Flute, which was to have overtones of Freemasonry. Schikaneder wrote the German-language libretto. Work went on during the summer, though the Requiem Mass was also in process, and in August and September he had to write another opera, La Clemenza di Tito, for the theatre in Prague. He travelled to Prague for the production. It met with a polite reception, but the whole effort, he composed it in 18 days, must have been wearing for him. Back in Vienna, the Magic Flute was performed on September 30th to tremendous acclaim. He was greatly uplifted by its reception, but it was not enough to relieve his illness. On November 20th he took to his bed. He continued to work on the Requiem Mass. It was church music such as he had not written for years. But he had just heard that when the Kapellmeister of St. Stephen's died, he would be given the job. Perhaps he felt he had to get his hand in. Mozart died on December 5th, 1791, the Requiem unfinished. But he had left directions with his pupil Süssmayr on how it should be done, and we have it now as a fitting end to a remarkable life. There have been several people in the history of mankind who have been blessed with extraordinary talents. It is not too much to say that Mozart's gifts and the delights he gave to the world have never been equalled. Mozart's output was huge, extremely varied, and of outstanding quality. His music falls roughly into 4 groups: orchestral works, religious music, chamber music, and dramatic works. A certain Ludwig von Köchel helpfully catalogued everything Mozart wrote and gave the pieces numbers, now called Köchel numbers. Much the largest group is of orchestral music. Mozart wrote over 40 symphonies. Those written towards the end of his life are the most loved and the most played. Most of these have nicknames. For example, number 31 in D major is called the Paris because he was there when he wrote it. Number 35 in D major is the Hafner. Number 36 in C major, the Linz. Number 38 in D major, the Prague. Number 40 in G minor has no nickname, and number 41 in C major is called the Jupiter Symphony. A second group of orchestral music is for solo voice or instrument with orchestra. For example, there are over 20 piano concertos. Köchel numbers 488 and 537, this one known as the Coronation, are outstanding among these. He wrote around 12 fine violin concertos, or works for violin and orchestra, like the G major one. A group of horn concertos are very exciting, and there are concertos for flute and orchestra and other combinations. Always hoping to get a church position, Mozart wrote a steady stream of religious music, like the Missa Solemnis in C major of 1780, or the famous Ave Verum Corpus of 1791. His last unfinished work was, of course, the Requiem Mass in D minor. A delightful and typical piece is Köchel number 165, a motet, Exultate Jubilate, for soprano, orchestra and organ. Mozart played the violin, of course, and he wrote a large amount of music for it. Amongst his chamber pieces there are 40 pieces for violin and piano, mostly sonatas. He was a brilliant pianist too, so Köchel lists over 50 works, sonatas, fugues, variations, rondos and fantasias. There are 10 works for 4 hands and 2 pieces for 2 pianos. Mozart did the piano proud. His finest chamber music lies in the quartets and quintets. In particular, there is the wonderful quintet in G minor for string quartet and viola. There are over 20 string quartets, and of course, as Mozart got better and better at writing quartets, it's no surprise that the last group of 10, like K465 in C major, it's the last of a group of 6 dedicated to Haydn, is the very best of Mozart. The last 3 quartets were dedicated to the King of Prussia. There are 2 fine piano quartets, one number 478 in G minor and another Köchel 493 in E flat major. There is also a number of piano trios and various other combinations which form a rich vein for the chamber musician. The field in which Mozart really stunned the world was in his 6 great operas. Almost all have excellent libretti, and certainly all have wonderful music. He wrote 12 operas in his early years as a build-up to his major work. Idomeneo, King of Crete, with an Italian libretto, was the first major one. This was followed by a comic opera in German, Die Entführung aus dem Serail, or The Escape from the Harem. Le Nozze di Figaro, The Marriage of Figaro, is a wonderful comedy based on a contemporary play by Beaumarchais. The libretto in fashionable Italian by Lorenzo da Ponte. Then Don Giovanni, the richly textured tale of Don Juan, the master seducer. Così fan tutti comes next, an untranslatable title, but something like All Women Do, tilts brilliantly at the vicissitudes of love in a way that reaches out across the centuries. And finally, Die Zauberflöte, the magic flute. Produced in only a few weeks, it's a stunning masterpiece of comedy and charm and profundity and magical music all rolled into one. The opera Le Nozze di Figaro, The Marriage of Figaro, the G minor quintet and the Symphony No. 40, also in G minor, are the very essence of Mozart.